Hello, my name is Walter Reiter, and I've been asked to say a few words about my new book, The Baroque Violin and Viola, a 50-lesson course, which has recently been published by Oxford University Press and is available in hardback, paperback, and in digital format. I usually manage to attend the London Early Music Festival and exhibition in person, but this year of all years, I've been unable to do so. Actually, it's for a good reason, because since the publication of the book, I've been asked to give some classes in various conservatoires around Europe, which is where I am now. Right now, I'm in a Baroque castle in Hesse, on my way to Basel, which is my first engagement tomorrow. The art of teaching has fascinated me ever since I landed my first job as a teenager while still at university, and teaching has been part of my life in the many places that I've lived since then. In 1975, I started a class for extremely talented youngsters in the Jerusalem Conservatory of Music. It was a daunting prospect at first because without knowing that much about teaching, I feared my teaching might be a form of experimentation on live humans. But I was privileged to be guided during those years by Professor Felix Andreevsky, who had freshly arrived from Moscow, where he'd been teaching in the Central Music School there. In order to be a teacher in the Soviet Union, you had to have a certain number of years as an assistant to another teacher, having studied pedagogy yourself. And Professor Andreevsky was like a walking encyclopedia, and he guided me from A to Z, the ins and outs of teaching children, teaching adults, from very basics of how to hold the bow, etc., to Paganini and Wieniawski, while at the same time supervising my young students. Fast forward to many years, to my first job as a Baroque violin teacher in Trinity Laban Conservatoire of Music in London, with none of the support I'd had before. Organising and structuring my teaching seemed essential in order to make it as efficient as possible. In the first year of bachelor study, there is just so much basic information to impart, from how to hold the violin to questions of temperament, intonation, rhetoric, ornamentation, etc. And I found that very few pieces of actual repertoire could be learned in a single academic year. Working on a simple sonata, let's say by Vivaldi, for example, with all the other surrounding topics that needed to be discussed in the interpretation of that work, could take 4 lessons, i.e. a whole month. Having students come to the lesson in order to receive information I could impart on those myriad musical and technical details, especially with the frankly absurd system of having 1 hour a week of instruction. Who on earth dreamed that one up? It definitely did not seem to be the most efficient approach. But, I thought, what if I wrote that information down so that my students could prepare the pieces in advance? Would they not learn faster using this upside-down inverted method? The results were no surprise. Those who spent the week before a lesson working through the information I'd written down could play more convincingly and in a more informed manner than those who had spent the week wondering what on earth I was going to say in their next lesson. After 2 years of working with this upside-down method, I approached a publisher with the idea of publishing a book called 6 Lessons on Baroque Violin. And the publisher was very enthusiastic with the idea. But my other half, she had other ideas. Such a book, she argued, could be of value not only to those actually studying the Baroque violin, but to all musicians generally who wanted to gain an insight into what historical performance actually meant on their instruments. And she persuaded me to offer the book to Oxford University Press. So, under great pressure, I wrote to them. To my utter astonishment, I received a reply after about 2 hours. They were very interested and I should send some material. That was the beginning of a 10-year journey during which the 6 lessons turned into 50 lessons. Let me read you my original title page, The Baroque Violin and Viola, a 50-lesson course, including detailed observations, musical and technical analyses, and explanations of sonatas from the 17th and 18th centuries, also transcribed for viola, and 120 specially devised exercises, being the author's gift to those curious and diligent lovers of Baroque music who wish to learn to play the Baroque violin and viola. In essence, my book is a practical, step-by-step, do-it-yourself course of lessons for violinists and violists, covering the interpretation, technique, the culture, and the historical background of the Baroque violin repertoire. It guides readers from basics to Bach via music from a wide variety of styles. Avoiding obscure musicological jargon, it is, I have been told, eminently readable and accessible. Packed with information, detailed observations on the music under discussion, and relevant quotations from historical and contemporary sources, it covers everything the Baroque violinist and violist should know and may be considered the equivalent of some 2 to even 3 years of individual lessons with me. The book contains over 100 exercises devised for and tested on live students over the years. My holistic approach to teaching is evident through the exercises aimed at bringing out the individual voice of each student, and my insistence that what happens within a person, that is to say, the identification and the manipulation of affects, is a vital part of successful performance. Imitating the voice, both spoken and sung, is a constant theme, beginning with a simple device of playing words. The 50 lessons include 5 ornamentation modules, lessons on specific topics, temperament, rhetoric, the affects, and so on, how to make friends with gut strings. And all the music, transcribed both for violin and viola, is available to download on the website, where there is also a series of video clips and audio clips. Now, I'll take you through a brief summary of the opening chapters of the book. Lesson 1 takes the form of a practical introduction, advising the reader on the basic equipment needed for the course of study, the options for acquiring a suitable violin and bow, etc. Follows a short history of gut strings, a section on how to choose them, and a practical guide to fitting them. Many students come and say, I've broken my string and I don't know how to fit them. And the lesson ends with a brief survey of Baroque pitch. Lesson 2 explores the way in which the violin was held during the Baroque period, using both textual and iconographic evidence. It begins by demonstrating why adapting one's hold is considered a necessary step towards reproducing the music, or rather the sounds, of the Baroque period. Certain advantages of the chin-off way of playing are explained, although I personally do not insist on that, while aspects of modern technique are arguably proven to be unhistorical. A thorough investigation of the sources takes up much of the lesson, with quotations by numerous writers from Jambe de Fer, 1556, to Campagnoli, 1797. And having presented the evidence, some of it contradictory, the lesson has detailed recommendations, acknowledging that, although the advice given constitutes a proven starting point, all students eventually find their own way, a way that feels right and comfortable for them. Now, the art of playing the Baroque violin is primarily the art of the bow. For without the bow, the violin is silent. In the next lesson, I discuss the intrinsic qualities of the old bow and explain why the modern bow is ill-suited to the demands of the Baroque repertoire. Quoting from a number of historical sources, from Muffat and Playford to L'Abbé le Fils, it provides information on the way the bow was held and explains how holding the violin in the way advocated in the previous lesson impacts on essential aspects of bow technique and posture. Now, instrumental treatises from the 16th century onwards stress the importance of imitating the human voice, an ideal that is advocated throughout my book. Lesson 4 begins with the student investigating the qualities of individual words and ends with the student declaiming Shakespeare on open strings, using the new liberated speaking bow that I've talked about. Simple words such as beautiful and Michelangelo are reproduced on open strings, bringing attention to the nature of rhythm and the living qualities of vowels. Many violinists find this challenging at first, having mastered the myriad technical elements that make up the ideal sound of the modern violin. They simplify rhythms that are actually subtle. Michelangelo. Ignoring the nuances of the vowels. Michelangelo. And use their bow in a conditioned manner, bow strokes. Learning the Baroque violin, therefore, involves a certain amount of unlearning, if you like, of those modern techniques. After this, we continue to the quest for a more rhetorical approach to playing by investigating in fine details not merely the rhythms, but also the actual sounds of words, their vowels, consonants, double consonants, diphthongs, as well as their meanings, very important. Ways of replicating these sounds and effects with the bow are explored. The aim is to lay aside cherished principles regarding sound, rhythm, and phrasing, and replace them by a pseudo-scientific method aimed at achieving a bow that speaks and obeys only the language, the laws of spoken language, and of course, dance. Can you hear my bow? Corelli is said to have said. It is speaking. Instead of isolated words, the lesson's focus is on a song in Italian by the Netherlands composer Sweelinck, written in 1612, which is to be sung or played, but Sweelinck specifically says, if you play it, you must play it as if you were singing it, with all the nuances of the voice. So in this lesson, there are specially devised exercises for realizing that text in sound. Although the lesson works from a single line, the score on the website contains two parts, the two parts of Sweelinck's original composition. So the song can be played by two violins, two violas, or one instrument and a singer. Learning to play without grasping the violin with the chin involves a certain reorganization of the body. And the next lesson contains exercises designed to help the body achieve this transition in a comfortable, tension-free way. 3 causes of tension are identified: technical factors, emotional factors, the will to express while tensing up the body, and nerves. Special attention is paid to the back and ways of monitoring and realizing tension while actually playing, letting go. The book's first complete music, written specifically for the violin, is the La Folia of Farinel. And this allows us to examine many basic concepts: rhythm, articulation, the retaking, or not, of the bow, punctuation, tessitura, impulses and rebounds, causes and effect, and the difference between good notes and bad notes. If all notes are important, no note is important. The link between phrasing and bowing is emphasized as being direct and crucial. The melody and bass lines are also shown to be inseparable, so one cannot consider one without the other. The lesson also shows the way to differentiate between how notes were written and how they were played in specific contexts, referring to the astonishing tonotechnie of engramelle, a sort of Baroque recording system. There are detailed observations and tips about almost every bar, plus specially devised exercises on, in this case, dotted notes, such as how to travel through the bow while playing dotted rhythms and exploring the vast spectrum of articulations. Now, music communicates emotions through the media of sound. And the next lesson approaches the 18th century concept of affect by examining how the juxtaposition of sounds elicit specific emotions, and how, by heightening our awareness of the impact of intervals, we can better communicate these emotions to the public. The lesson quotes from Geminiani's definition of the intention of music, the writings of Descartes, Matheson, Quantz, Kirnberger, as well as Quintilian's great treatise on institutes of oratory. The intrinsic messages aroused by sounds, I label them emotional information. And this is a concept, a central concept of my book. And we learn to evoke particular emotions at will, as actors do. And we practice this skill by projecting contrasting emotions onto a movement by Handel. When I say as actors do, an actor who is very, very happy and everything's going well in his life and he has to go onto stage and act King Lear, he must make that mental switch to get into the affect of this aging, crazy king. We must make our switches on our emotional keypads that we have to get into the certain affect which we identify as the affect of that particular movement or phrase. And we practice this skill by projecting contrasting emotions onto a movement by Handel. So just a few lines of music played with the emotion of doubt or anger or ecstasy. One essential element of musical expression, of course, is the living sound, capable of holding the constant attention of our public. The book traces that ubiquitous concept from Caccini's swelling and abating of the voice, which is right at the beginning of the 17th century, to the violin etudes of Mazas, 1843. In the Baroque sound, free from the all-pervasive vibrato of modern times, it was the responsibility of the bow to provide this, what I call, inner life of sound. Based mainly on the writings of Tartini, Geminiani, and Leopold Mozart, Lesson 9 contains exercises for perfecting the expressive device that guarantees this living sound, what we call the messa di voce. The many different aspects of its technique, gleaned from the sources, are isolated and explained in detail, from simple pressure with the forefinger to the addition of some vibrato. Of course, the imparting of information and ideas is only one aspect of the teacher's role, the teacher's art. The other part is that of drawing out the innate natural musicality of each individual student, encouraging initiative, even when the outcome is questionable, respecting and nurturing that uniqueness which is every artist's birthright. Such a task may be easier in the classroom than in the context of a written word. Nevertheless, I have attempted to minimize this shortcoming by giving indications and devising exercises to help the reader develop his or her inner voice and to convey that inner voice into the outer world of sound. Having dealt with many primary issues, the book examines in microscopic detail sonatas by Corelli and Vivaldi. This familiar, accessible music is excellent material for an initial exploration of many basic interpretive and technical aspects of Baroque violin playing. So the observation section dealing with these sonatas and relevant issues are many pages long. The study of the early Baroque sonata, the early 17th century Baroque sonata, is preceded by an examination of its origins in vocal music. Thus, the Historical transition from vocal to instrumental music is reenacted within the experience of the reader. Indeed, we even pay a visit to the Camerata of Florence when we meet Count Bardi, Caccini, and others discussing Plato and setting to music the verses of Dante. By the way, on a recent visit to Florence, we visited the palazzo where the Camerata was held. And you know what? You can actually stay there, book on Airbnb. Don't forget to pack a theorbo. There followed detailed lessons by Fontana, Castello, Pandolfi Miale, and even a whole lesson from Rognoni himself. Later we study sonatas by Schmelzer and Bieber. He gets 2 whole lessons to himself, before setting off to encounter the sophisticated world of the French Baroque, and in particular the music of one of the most exquisite exponents, François Couperin. Our journey ends in Leipzig with the music of J.S. Bach, the culmination and arguably the climax of our Baroque journey. By the way, just a few days ago, I had the pleasure of performing all the Bach sonatas in the house where Bach was born. It's just a little cellar underneath where they used to keep the animals. It's now a concert hall. A true understanding of Baroque music cannot, I believe, be achieved merely by practicing within a sealed studio. I have therefore included 4 interludes set in Florence, Rome, Versailles, and in Germany that provide information on the historical, political, and cultural backdrop to the repertoire under discussion. A visit to Bernini's studio in Rome, where we learn to transfer visual images into sound, has proved an especially enjoyable exercise. Of course, there is much in the way of ideas, exercises, information that come directly from whatever crumbs of knowledge I may have picked up after half a century of teaching and thinking about teaching. For there is no substitute for experience, I believe. Writing the book was the single most fruitful learning experience of my entire life, for there's a world of difference between communicating a thought to a student and being able to write that thought down. Quotations need to be checked. Was it Montclair who said that? Or was it Rousseau? And what precisely did he say? And where is the quote? And who do I have to ask for permission to quote it? You know, everything you think is in the public domain actually needs permission if you want to publish it yourself. Finding out who owns the rights to a book or a translation can be tricky, as the original publisher might have been bought up by another one and then merged with a third. My hardest task was to track down the translator of Mattheson's Vollkommene Kapellmeister, Ernest Harris. I couldn't trace him anywhere. Finally, I found a picture on Google Images, and it was, sadly, of a gravestone with his name on it and a picture of a little piano. I told my editor I had found him 6 feet under the ground in a cemetery in Tennessee, I believe. But no, she said, you have to find the person who owns his legal estate. How I did it, I cannot begin to say. But it wasn't even sure that he'd had a partner, and that if he had, he or she would have had the same name. But hours of detective work eventually did yield results, and I received a charming email from his widow, Elaine, that she would be so happy to see her husband's work used in this way. Now, of course, there is no correct way to play the violin or the viola, to interpret a sonata, to shape a phrase, to colour a single note. The independent-minded student will derive much benefit from thoughtfully challenging what I have written. Perhaps that freedom of dissent is one of the advantages of learning from a book. I am well aware that there is much in these volumes that is personal and subjective. It could not be otherwise. Similarly, although we are right to explore and revere the historical sources, we should nevertheless be aware of their subjectivity, for they inevitably reflect the taste and preferences of the author, and may, and do, occasionally criticize practices of which they personally did not approve, but which, by implication, were commonplace at the time. Moreover, they don't always provide us with substantial and specific information. Indeed, some sources are lamentably vague, even bare. Had they foreseen that musicians in the distant 21st century, our ears ringing with the sounds of Kortag and Philip Glass and Paul McCartney, would once again seek to interpret their music and reproduce their sound worlds, the great performers, composers, teachers, and treatise writers of the Baroque period might well have been a little more forthcoming with their information. My book, which by the way won the 2021 Music and Drama Education Award in the category Outstanding Music Education Resource, humbly attempts to rectify some of their omissions and to weave together the disparate strands of available information into a single detailed pedagogic work. Thank you for listening.